Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I thought this seemed really interesting. I saw that my friend Mr. Terry the other day did a video called Why the Rest of the World Thinks Americans Are Brainwashed. It's from a channel I'm not familiar with. It's called Holy Koolaid. So I think this will be really interesting. It's one of the lenses through which we can view history is how people are taught history, and we've done a lot of videos over time debunking some of the ways in which we are taught history in the United States, and the ways in which people are taught history in other places, and how it necessarily kind of gives a particular bias to that history that is framed in a certain way. So I'll be very curious to see what he has to say about this. Like I said, not familiar with this channel, but I'll put the link down in the description. Haven't seen this video. I didn't watch Mr. Terry's reaction. So we'll just react and push back where I feel like I don't agree with them, offer some context, and just kind of fill in the gaps a little bit. I want to thank, and the only name I have to go on here is what you have on Patreon, Mr. Chris, great name by the way, for your support on Patreon. Could not do this without you. Let's dive into this one. Hey, it's Future Chris here. I'm just coming back to the beginning of the video now that I have finished my reaction to it, because I want to encourage you with something. You're going to find that especially early on in this reaction, I push back against a lot of things. It doesn't necessarily mean that I think he's completely wrong, but I like to, when people are giving a lot of opinions and when they're offering a particular viewpoint, I like to push back against that viewpoint, because that way you have the opportunity to make your own decisions and find yourself somewhere in the middle. So if you hear me pushing back a lot, don't get freaked out, especially if you agree with him and not with me. Stick around, because I think you'll find toward the end that there are a lot more things that he says that I actually strongly agree with. So get past the disagreements and the pushback. You'll get there.
There is some wild propaganda that Americans are taught and don't even realize it's propaganda. Now, I should preface this by stating that I am an American. I love my country. My family goes all the way back to Jamestown. My grandfather fought in World War II. I was born in Los Angeles. I went to university in Texas. I was raised singing the Star-Spangled Banner and reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. I'm about as American as it gets. Well, besides these guys. But I've also spent the last decade studying cults, dogma, and religious extremism, and thought control. And as someone who has lived in over a dozen countries and traveled to more than 35 of them, I've started noticing some extremely troubling forms of propaganda that Americans are taught from childhood.
And I would dare say that this is probably something that's true of most countries. Most countries, you're going to have a particularly biased viewpoint toward or against certain things that you're going to be raised with. And it's one of the reasons why I really encourage people, if you have the means and the ability, to get out and view other countries, because I think your perspective will inevitably change about your own country, but especially about those other places. Once you get out and experience the people, experience the culture, get out of your own bubble. Even if you're just here in the United States, get out of your own bubble when it comes to your personal beliefs, your religious beliefs, your political beliefs, your socioeconomic beliefs. Get to know people who don't think and act like you do. It'll really benefit you in the long run, I think.
That people in free developed democratic countries overseas find absolutely bizarre, and things that most Americans never question, because we've been marinating in it since birth.
Okay, I don't know where he's going to go with all of this, but just because people in other countries find it bizarre doesn't necessarily mean they're right and we're wrong. I could say the same thing about stuff that we find that's bizarre that other countries do. I find it really bizarre that people in Europe use mayonnaise on their fries. I think it's a crime against humanity, but it's not wrong. It's just different.
And look, every country has its own brand of propaganda. I'm not trying to pretend that America is uniquely evil here, but what makes American propaganda so effective is that most of us don't even realize it exists. We think that propaganda is something that happens in North Korea or Soviet bases.
Well, it's because everybody recognizes it when they see it in other places, because we're outside of that bubble. I think you could probably say the same thing about other countries.
Of dictators and state-controlled media. We don't recognize it when it's sung at football games and printed on a bumper sticker. So here are 7 forms of propaganda that you probably didn't even realize that you grew up with if you're an American.
Now, I'm guessing, because he made a reference to the fact that he has been studying religious dogma and things like that, and the fact that his channel is called Holy Koolaid, I'm going to guess is a direct reference to Jonestown and the death of over 900 people that followed Jim Jones that drank the Kool-Aid that was laced with cyanide. And it's become a metaphor for people who blindly follow without really questioning.
Number 1, US-centric education. American history is extraordinarily short. We are talking a few centuries compared to civilizations that span millennia. And yet,
okay, that's fair, but don't all countries probably focus their history education on their own country? I mean, that makes a lot of sense.
if you grew up in an American public school, you would think that the United States was the center of human history. Geography classes often aren't taught at all, and world history courses, when they are taught, are basically how does the rest of the planet relate to America?
I don't know if I agree with that. Now listen, it's been a while since I've been in a classroom, either as a student or as a teacher. But I don't. Yes, it focuses heavily on American history because we're Americans. But this idea we didn't learn geography, I had a whole year of geography in middle school, and we integrated geography into other things. We definitely learned other parts of history, and in college especially, we took entire courses on other histories besides the United States.
The Vietnam War is taught as a war for freedom. Westward expansion is framed as brave pioneers taming a wild frontier.
I mean, that part's true, though I think that's changing as well. But I don't remember the Vietnam War being sold as a war for freedom, and I grew up in the decade or so after the Vietnam War ended.
As the systematic displacement and genocide of indigenous peoples who've been living there for thousands of years.
It's both. Yes, it's focused on the westward expansion, but I think we're doing a much better job lately of mentioning the fact and integrating into it the fact that westward expansion necessarily then also meant the destruction of people's cultures and homelands. It's both true.
World War II, Americans swoop in and save the day, with little mention of the roughly 27 million Soviets who died on the Eastern Front doing the bulk of the fighting against Hitler.
Now understand that part is that for many of us, we grew up in the end of the Cold War era. The Soviet Union was the enemy. So it makes a lot of sense that at that time we're not preaching the virtues of the millions of Soviet soldiers who died on the Eastern Front at a time when we're living in a world that has been largely dominated, at least Eastern Europe has been dominated by the oppression of the Soviet regime that it acquired in the aftermath of that war.
Oh, compare that to how other countries teach history. In much of Europe, kids actually learn global history.
All right, now let me push back on this for just a second, because there was a poll that was done a number of years ago. Let's talk about World War II. And in that poll, they asked people in various countries what country is most responsible for the Allied victory in World War II. In the United Kingdom, the number one answer was the United Kingdom. In Russia, the number one answer was the Soviet Union. In the United States, the number one answer was the United States. But in many of the countries, the number two answer was the United States. So U.S. is not alone in thinking that we were most responsible for winning World War II. I don't know that I agree with him on all of this.
Study African kingdoms, Asian dynasties, Middle Eastern contributions to science and mathematics.
I'd love to see what Mr. Terry says about this, because he is still a teacher in public schools. And I'm curious to know if he pushes back on this, because I know that we teach this stuff in school.
Learn about colonialism for what it actually is, not heroic adventure, but exploitation. When I talk to Americans who are traveling abroad for the first time, I'm often shocked at how little they know about the rest of the world. And that's not by accident. A nation which doesn't teach its citizens about the world produces citizens who don't question their own nation's role in it. Number 2, the Cold War binary. If you grew up in America anytime after 1950, you absorbed one of the most effective propaganda frameworks ever constructed. Communism equals evil, capitalism equals freedom. Full stop. No nuance, no discussion, just a clean binary where one side wears white hats and the other side is a cartoon villain.
In most of human history, we've done it that way about any topic, right? We do the same thing about World War II, bad guys and good guys. We are just by nature people who see everything in black and white. And one of the things I think I've pushed a ton on this channel is that there are shades of gray. That said, there are fewer shades of gray when it comes to East versus West in the Cold War than there might be in other places. Yes, the United States, especially through the CIA with some of our regime change things, terrible stuff, not effective. But this idea that somehow there's no good guy and bad guy, I mean, there's some very clear differences between Soviet communism and Western capitalism that I think are pretty clearly good guy versus bad guy.
They don't teach you is that during the Cold War, the United States overthrew democratically elected governments around the world simply because the governments leaned left.
That's absolutely true, and we should definitely proclaim that as a bad thing.
In 1953, the CIA helped orchestrate a coup against Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, because he nationalized Iran's oil industry. In 1954, the US toppled Guatemala's president, Arbenz, because his land reforms threatened the profits of United Fruit Company. In 1973, the CIA backed the overthrow of Chile's Salvador Allende, a democratically elected socialist, and replaced him with Augusto Pinochet, a brutal military dictator who tortured and murdered thousands.
He's 100% right about all of this, and like I said, definitely some areas where you can criticize strongly the United States when it comes to its anti-communist policy. But please, let's not take it as far as to say they were both equally bad. Yes, I know what I just did.
Congo, Brazil, Indonesia, it's all the same playbook. America claimed to be defending democracy while systematically destroying it in order to exploit country after country. This all is recent.
I don't know how much I'd say exploit country after country versus oppose the Soviet Union specifically.
History, and this binary thinking is still alive and well. If you suggest universal healthcare in America, watch how quickly someone calls you a communist. Propose free public university education, something that dozens of thriving democracies already provide, and
this is a fair point. I think there is definitely a connection between people who grew up in the Cold War and see socialism and communism as inherently evil, who have an automatic pushback against anything that might suggest a hint of socialism. That's absolutely true. I think that's going to change in another generation or so when, because I'm like the tail end of the generations who grew up in the Cold War. I was 13 when the Cold War kind of came to an end. So, my children's generation don't really have that view of the world.
Suddenly you're a Marxist. The Cold War ended over 30 years ago, but the propaganda framework it built is still alive and kicking. Number 3, the land of the free myth. Americans are told from birth that the United States is the freest country on earth. It's in the songs, it's on the bumper stickers. It's baked into the nation's identity so deeply.
I wouldn't say that saying land of the free and home of the brave is an indication that we are the freest country. Yes, a lot of Americans do believe that. I understand that. But I don't know if I would use that as an example of why.
Questioning it feels almost heretical. But is it true? Well, let's look at the data. On the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index, the US doesn't crack the top 50. It ranks 57th in the world, just below Sierra Leone. On the Cato Institute's Human Freedom Index, and keep in mind, the Cato Institute is a libertarian think tank, not some leftist outfit, multiple countries outrank America in both personal and economic freedom.
All right, so here's the issue with and listen, I'm not making the argument the United States is the freest country on earth. I do want to give some context to these freedom indexes for a second. There's a lot of different ones out there, and they use a lot of different criteria to weight their freedom indexes. A European model, for example, is going to be more likely to weight things that what we would call positive freedoms, like things that are actively done or provided. So, for example, having nationalized health care, like the systems that many Western democracies have in Europe, that is considered a freedom index, a positive on the freedom index. The United States not having that is a net negative. So, you can make the argument, well, I don't see what that has to do with freedom, right? It depends on your viewpoint on that. Here in the United States, people would probably argue, well, having the freedom to choose my own health care is freedom, rather than having it thrust on me by the government and forcing me to pay my taxes for it. Many Americans would view that as actually a negative freedom, whereas in Europe, that's viewed as a positive freedom. Another thing that happens is in some of these freedom indexes, they weight everything equally. So, for example, the freedom to be able to trade internationally without tariffs is given the same weight as being able to travel from Ohio to California freely. Whereas in some countries you might not be able to do that. Those are weighted equally, and you can see where there's an inherent bias in that. And then, of course, things like press freedoms and things like that, a lot of times are very subjective depending on what you view as freedom. So I'm not debating the idea that we should get it out of our minds that America is somehow uniquely free. But I do just want to point out that those freedom indexes have a lot of inherent biases in them.
The United States incarcerates more people per capita than almost every other country on the planet. More than China, more than Russia, Iran, or North Korea.
But here's where I would argue, yes, but that only applies to people who break the law. I have never been incarcerated. I've never spent a single minute in jail. Does that mean that somehow my freedom is less true because someone else has broken the law and ended up in prison? Now, we can have debates about the nature of our prison system, the privatization of it. I've got a private prison not far from me. The sentences that we give, the argument about whether or not there are racial biases in our sentencing and in our policies. Those are all legitimate arguments to have.
Land of the free locks up more of its own citizens than almost every authoritarian regime on Earth, and a disproportionate number of them are Black and Latino. This is not what freedom looks like. It is a system designed to warehouse people. But it goes deeper. A handful of corporations control vast swaths of American industry, from media to agriculture to healthcare and tech. These corporations aren't just influencing a little bit of government policy.
Okay, but how's that healthcare, for example, different than the entire healthcare system being run by the government? I'm trying to understand how corporations running healthcare is less free than the government running healthcare. So you see, again, there's my own bias coming in terms of how I'm viewing that. But I'm just saying there's a counter argument to a lot of these.
Policy, they're writing the policy. Politicians respond to donors and lobbyists, not constituents. Hell, there was a Princeton study which actually found that the preferences of American voters have a near zero statistical impact on whether a policy gets passed or not. But the preferences of economic elites, big businesses, and organized interest groups are strongly correlated with what policies actually get passed into law.
The preferences of voters do matter, though, because the voters are the ones who put the people in office who make those policies. Now, we can argue about what influences those lawmakers to make those policies, but don't tell me for a second that if Kamala Harris were president of the United States instead of Donald Trump, that we would have the exact same policies in our government. That's ridiculous. Nobody thinks that.
In other words, your politicians don't care what you want, unless you're a billionaire. Elections are largely bought and paid for. Gerrymandering carves up districts so that the politicians can choose their voters rather than the other way around, like it should be in a free democracy.
And don't give me the argument that only one side does it. They both do it, and at this point, nobody's even making a secret of the fact they're trying to do it.
Suppression laws target communities least likely to vote for the people in power, and the two-party system has become a self-reinforcing trap that incentivizes extremism over representation.
100% true.
We are taught, and this is hardcore propaganda, that America's electoral system is the best. Well, except when our guy loses, of course. But there is a much better electoral system.
I don't remember being taught it's the best. I remember that at the time that America was founded, it was pretty unique in terms of other world governments and what they had. Now, granted, a lot of the world has caught up and maybe in many cases surpassed us at this point. But that wasn't always the case.
System. It is called ranked choice voting. And the only people who prefer our current system over ranked choice are those who are financially incentivized against freedom and democracy. Here's how it works. With ranked choice, instead of picking just one candidate and hoping for the best, you rank out your preferences with your top choice at the top and your least choice at the bottom. If no one wins a majority, the candidate with the fewest votes gets eliminated, and the people who voted for them have those votes redistributed to their second choice. You keep going until someone actually has majority support. It rewards candidates who appeal broadly rather than those who energize the extremes. It reduces what's known as the spoiler effect.
Right, and we saw that happen in Alaska, for example, where a heavily Republican Alaska actually sent a Democrat to Congress and didn't elect Sarah Palin to Congress because of ranked choice voting.
And creates a better reflection of what voters actually want. There are already several US cities and states which have already adopted ranked choice voting, and it's the norm in countries like Australia and Ireland. But most Americans have never even heard of it, because the two parties currently in power have zero incentive to tell you about the system that would threaten their grip, and they have every incentive to criticize it.
You should run aggressively against ranked choice voting. It is a big...
Number 4, America's stupidly big military budget. The US spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined.
Yeah, but I think everybody knows that, right? I mean, there's no secret here. I think we know that that's the case.
Let that sink in. More than China, Russia, the UK, Saudi Arabia, Germany, France, Japan, South Korea, and Australia put together. Now, Americans are taught that this spending is about protecting freedom and defending the free world. And sure, a reasonable national defense is necessary. But the vast majority of this budget doesn't go to defense. It funds over 750 military bases in at least 80 countries.
Right, and this is, again, I'm going to offer a different viewpoint on this. And that is that, you know, a lot of countries argue, well, if we just didn't spend our money on the military the way we did, then we could have money for education and healthcare and things like that. And that's absolutely true. But one of the reasons why many of those other countries are able to not spend as much on their militaries is because of all of those bases we have all over the world. You know, we've got 35,000 soldiers in Germany right now, for example. We've got soldiers in South Korea. We've got soldiers in the Middle East. I say soldiers, but I mean military of all kinds. And if all of them were pulled out, and listen, whatever you think of Donald Trump, this was something he argued for. He argues for a lot of things and changes his mind. I get that. But, you know, pulling those troops out and reducing our spending, great. But that means those other countries then are going to have to increase their spending to compensate for it. And now you're going to have that top 10 versus 1 thing kind of shrink a little bit.
Funds interventions, regime changes, drone programs, and the maintenance of a global military empire. Meanwhile, American roads are crumbling, bridges are collapsing, the healthcare system bankrupts families, teachers buy their own classroom supplies, student debt has surpassed $1.7 trillion, and millions of Americans can't afford basic prescriptions. Other countries, meanwhile, invest their resources differently. Universal healthcare, free or affordable higher education, robust public transit, paid parental leave.
Much higher taxes to compensate for those things, too. It's not just a matter of if we slash our military spending, suddenly we're going to have the money for all of that. It's going to have to come through much higher taxes.
Affordable childcare.
And I'm not arguing one way or another about that. I'm just pointing out the reality of it. You know, you go to some of these countries and you tell them that half of our country doesn't pay any federal income tax at the end of the year. They get a refund. I mean, for most of my adult life, I got a refund back that was more than what I paid in to federal income taxes. Now I'm paying out the wazoo, and it's just painful to write that check. And I still pay relatively low income tax compared to what people pay in a lot of these countries.
And as a result, their citizens are measurably healthier, better educated, less stressed, and by many metrics, happier. This isn't...
The health part? Yeah, look at the food. I mean, any American who goes to Europe, for example, go to Europe, go to other countries, spend a week or two there, and then come back and eat our food, you'll feel miserable. You know, you can go to Italy and eat a whole plate of pasta, and you're not going to feel bloated and disgusting at the end of it. You can even eat the junk food and drink the soda, the pop, and, you know, places in Europe, and you're not going to be as at the end of the day, because they don't have the awful ingredients that we're putting into our food, and the high fructose corn syrup and all this other stuff. That's our major issue. Yes, healthcare, big problem, but let's start with the food.
Speculative, it's what the data consistently shows. Historians have a term for what happens when an empire pours its resources into military expansion while its domestic foundations rot. Imperial overstretch. And it's how empires collapse. The Romans did it, the British did it, the Soviets did it, and if you look at the trajectory, America is running headfirst over the same cliff.
Fair.
Number 5, the Pledge of Allegiance. Having children stand up every single morning, place their hands over their heart, face a flag, and recite a loyalty oath in unison is, by any outside standard, one of the creepiest things about America. I'm not saying this to be edgy. When you describe this practice to people from other democracies, their jaws hit the floor. They assume
It's relatively recent that people feel that way. Like, I don't think my generation growing up thought too much of it. And there were people that didn't. I had Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, in my class that didn't stand for the pledge, and I don't recall anybody being especially freaked out by the fact that they didn't do it. But yeah, I think there has been a change in the views on the Pledge of Allegiance, and I think that's another one of those things that was kind of born out of the Cold War that maybe is past its time now.
associate it with the kind of thing that you would see authoritarian regimes do, not in a country that calls itself the leader of the free world. Because think about what the pledge actually is. It is a feudal fealty oath. It is a declaration of personal loyalty to a state. Now, I understand.
I don't got a problem with that, though. I got no problem with people declaring their loyalty to America. I think that's a good thing. Requiring it, which I don't think anybody requires it, it's obviously greatly encouraged in the places where it happens.
Understand why elected officials and military personnel swear oaths of service. That makes sense. They're accepting a position of public responsibility. But requiring a 6-year-old to pledge allegiance to a flag before they can even spell allegiance, it's brainwashing. Like, you realize the founding
I'd push back on the idea of brainwashing, but I get it.
fathers would be horrified by this, right? These were men who literally...
Wait a second. Our founding fathers would be horrified by loyalty oaths? Time out. So let's talk for a second about the oaths of fidelity and support. In some form or another, in some place or another, all 13 original states had loyalty oaths. In fact, in some places, they were so serious that you had people leave. So in Pennsylvania, for example, a lot of Mennonites left Pennsylvania and went to other places like Virginia, to the Shenandoah Valley, because they were ostracized for refusing to take an oath of loyalty. So, for example, this oath in Maryland was enacted by the Maryland General Assembly in 1777. All persons holding any office of profit or trust, including attorneys, and all voters were required to take the oath no later than March 1st, 1778. Exceptions were made for Quakers and all those already serving in the military, Mennonites, and Dunkers. That was in Maryland. In some places, there was no such exception. I do swear I do not hold myself bound to yield any allegiance or obedience to the King of Great Britain or his heirs or successors, and that I will be true and faithful to the state of Maryland, and will to the utmost of my power, support, maintain, and defend the freedom and independence thereof, and the government as now established against all open enemies and secret and traitorous conspiracies, and will use my utmost to disclose and make known to the governor or someone of the judges or justices thereof all treasons or traitorous conspiracies, attempts, or combinations against this state or government thereof, which may come to my knowledge, so help me God. And yes, free men over the age of 18 that did not take the oath faced repercussions, including having to pay triple the initially assessed amount of taxes every year in their lifetime, being unable to file lawsuits, hold any political office, vote, serve in the military, practice law, medicine, preach, be a tradesman, or teach at a school. So each of the 13 original states required some variation of the oath of fidelity and support, usually in the form of a pledge of allegiance to their particular state, sometimes as an independent state, or to the United States as independent states. Okay, rant over.
threw off the yoke of another red, white, and blue flag when it represented
Hey, kudos to him for getting the right flag for that time period.
Really threw off the yoke of another
You don't have the red X that represents Northern Ireland today.
red, white, and blue flag when it represented tyranny. They understood and wrote extensively about the fact that it is the duty of every free person to question authority and resist tyranny, not just pledge blind loyalty to a piece of cloth. The entire American experiment was built on the idea that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, and that when a government fails its people, those people have the right and the obligation to challenge it. This is the entire.
And what did George Washington do when people challenged the government during the Whiskey Rebellion? He rode out of the head of an army to put it down. Let's not appeal to the Founding Fathers as sources of virtue when it comes to supporting the right of people to oppose their government.
Reasoning behind the Second Amendment. Creating mindless, loyal zombies out of children is the exact opposite of what the founders fought for, and yet suggests that we stop doing this.
No, they fought for not being loyal to the British. They didn't fight for the idea of not being loyal to a government.
Children's schools, and watch how fast you get called un-American. Number 6, the myth that America was founded as a Christian nation.
True.
If you've ever driven through the American South, or honestly, large parts of the Midwest and rural America, you've probably seen billboards saying things like, hell is real, abortion is murder, and Jesus saves. They line the highways like wallpaper, so pervasive that most people stop noticing them. Religious messaging in America is so saturated into the culture that it becomes invisible, which is exactly what makes it so effective. But here's what a lot of Americans don't know. The United States was never a Christian nation. The founders were explicit about this. The Constitution makes zero mention of Christianity or Jesus. The First Amendment enshrines the separation of church and state.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Okay, so he just said there's no reference to Christianity in the Constitution. Absolutely true. There's also no reference to separation of church and state in the Constitution. Read the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free practice thereof. All right, that has nothing to do with separation of church and state. Has everything to do with Congress not establishing Christianity or any sect of Christianity or any other religion as the state religion, or requiring people to be a particular religion to vote or to be citizens or to participate in the government. That's all absolutely true.
The Treaty of Tripoli, unanimously ratified by the Senate in 1797 and signed by President John Adams, states in very plain language that the government of the United States is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion.
I agree with him 100%. The United States is not a Christian nation. It was founded largely by Christians. Most of the founding fathers were Christians. Some were deists, some were other religions or no religion. But it doesn't make us inherently a Christian nation.
That is not my interpretation. That is a legally binding document from the founding generation. So, where did the Christian nation myth come from? Well, in keeping with the rest of this video, propaganda. Cold War propaganda, to be specific. Under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954. In God We Trust was added to the paper currency in 1957 and adopted as the national motto.
Right, but In God We Trust appears on currency much, much earlier than that. It just wasn't required and it wasn't on all currency.
Motto the year before. Our original motto, E Pluribus Unum, is more about plurality. Out of many, one. Both of these actions were deliberate moves to contrast the United States against godless communism.
Right.
They weren't ancient traditions passed down by the founders. They're marketing decisions.
But again, In God We Trust is not an inherently Christian message, though many people see it that way.
Were made by politicians in the 1950s. And now, barely 70 years later, millions of Americans will swear on a stack of Bibles that this country was founded as a Christian nation, and that anyone who says otherwise is attacking their heritage. The conflation of patriotism with Christianity is itself a product of propaganda. And
True.
It's one of the most dangerous, because it means that questioning religion in America isn't just seen as blasphemy, it's treason. Number 7.
I wouldn't go that far. I agree with him that a lot of people are God and country and don't really separate one or the other, but I've never heard anyone, at least not reasonable people, maybe a very, very, very tiny fringe minority, equate being atheist with being treasonous. No serious person thinks that.
American exceptionalism. This one is huge. The one that ties all the rest of it together. American exceptionalism isn't just this belief that America is different. It's a belief that America is inherently superior, better,
True.
divinely favored, the greatest country that God ever put on this earth. And it functions not just as a belief, but as a social enforcement mechanism. Because in America, criticism of the country is treated as betrayal. Point out that other nations have better healthcare outcomes, and you're told, well, why don't you just move there? So
100% agree with him on this one. Now America for a good bit of its history was exceptional on the world stage in terms of the things we fought for and the things that we stood up for. I think we've lost a lot of that, but I also don't think we're necessarily exceptional and alone in anything at this point. And I agree 100% with him about this attitude that people have that if you dare criticize America, well, why don't you just move to that other place then if you think they're so much better? That's a stupid thing to say to people. If you advocate for universal health care, for example, oh, why don't you just move to Denmark or England where they have universal health care? No. These are people who see something that they think would be beneficial to their own country, and they want to advocate for that in their own country, and that should be okay. Even if you disagree with it, fight about it on the political stage. Stand for what you believe in, but don't, dismiss anybody who says the least negative thing about the United States as being un-American. I think it's inherently American to want to disagree and to argue for things and to want to make our country better, even if you might disagree about what it means to make it better.
Just that the military budget is bloated, and it is bloated, and suddenly you hate our troops. If you point out that Americans rank poorly on education, press freedom, or infant mortality compared to other developed countries, you're suddenly ungrateful.
Of all of these, and I've pushed back against a lot of them, probably stronger than maybe I should, but of all of these, this is the one I agree with the most. He's 100% right about all of this.
Liberals and progressives who critique America specifically because they want to improve it get branded as unpatriotic.
Yeah.
Do you see how backwards that is?
He's absolutely right.
Messaging is clear. You can love America or you can criticize it. You can't do both. But
I think it's the height of loving my country to say, you know what, I love my country while also acknowledging that it's not perfect. What have we heard about, making a more perfect union? That was something the founding fathers said, right? In our founding documents, in order to establish a more perfect union. We want it to be better. It can always improve. We can argue about what that means, but it's not un-American to want it to be better.
In most healthy democracies, critique is understood as a form of patriotism. 100%. Wanting your country to live up to its own ideals isn't betrayal. It is the highest form of civic engagement.
Yes,
The pressure to never question America, to treat any criticism as an attack, to reflexively defend the status quo no matter how messed up it is because admitting a problem feels like admitting defeat. That social pressure is itself one of the most effective forms of propaganda there is, because it doesn't require a government agency or state-run media outlets. It's enforced by your neighbors and your coworkers, your family, and your own internalized guilt. Like I said at the beginning, I don't hate America. I want it to be better. And if that makes me un-American in your eyes, then, well, I think I kind of proved my point. It is the civic duty of every citizen to question what we've been taught, to explore outside the bubble, whether that's through reading, traveling, or learning other languages.
And I've been having this conversation with people right now in my own life that asking questions is a good thing. It's how we find answers. If we just shut out the opportunity to doubt and question and inquire, and maybe I'm not sure that's true, then we miss opportunities to learn and to grow and to do better. So absolutely question your faith, question your government, question everything in your life. Seek answers. That's how we become stronger in what we believe. That's how we become more educated. And I say this all the time when it comes to politics. I have no problem with people who disagree with me passionately on political issues, as long as these are people who know what they believe and why. Defend it. Make your argument. Don't just tell me, well, it's just what I think. Have a reason why. That's how we become better as a country.
Languages, using LingoPie, of course, and exposing ourselves to the perspectives that challenge our own assumptions.
Yeah.
It's our duty to push back against propaganda and to exercise the very First Amendment rights that we claim to value. Because things don't have to be like this. They can be better. But we have to first recognize the propaganda and be honest with ourselves in order to get there. If you guys
All right, that was good. I really enjoyed that. There were some things I agreed with, some things I strongly disagreed with, but I think that that's a healthy thing. And hopefully you have had the opportunity now to hear some of this. Maybe if you're not an American, you might have heard some of this and been shocked by some of what Americans do think and believe. And some of you as Americans might say, yeah, that's exactly what my experience was. Different generations, different parts of the country, different beliefs growing up. We all have different perspectives on this. So I would love to hear your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Just disagree without being disagreeable. Let's debate, let's talk, let's learn and grow together. Thanks for watching.